In 1911, the city of Atlanta in Georgia was rocked by a series of women being murdered, making the headlines in the newspapers. But the killing spree had begun 2 years earlier. In April 1909, the first body of an African-American woman was discovered in what was known as the Old Fourth Ward, a historic district of Atlanta. She was Della Reed, who was found dead in a pile of rubbish, and 5 months later, the body of another woman was found. In 1910, 7 women were murdered. These were Estella Baldwin in March, who died of a concussion, followed by Georgia Brown in April, then Mattie Smith, Lavinia Austin, Sarah Jukes, Frances Lampkin, Eliza Griggs, and Maggie Brooks, who'd all been shot. In January 1911, 35-year-old housewife Rosa Trice hadn't returned home, and her body was found in Gardner Street, not far from her house. She'd been dragged, stabbed with a knife, her throat cut, and her head smashed in a ferocious attack. Her husband, John, came under suspicion, but was released as there was no evidence that he was involved. Then, in February, the body of another woman, Lucinda McNeil, was found in similar circumstances. In May, Rosa Rivers was shot and killed. On 28 May, the sister of Mary Walker, known as Belle, had become anxious as the cook hadn't returned home the previous night from her work. She went to look for her and discovered her body on Garibaldi Street, just 25 yards from her home. Her throat had been cut. Lena Sharp, the 8th victim, was murdered in June 1911 and had her head nearly decapitated. Lena had left her house that evening to visit a market, and when she didn't return home, her daughter, Emma Lou Sharp, went to find her. She went on to tell the police that she herself had been attacked. She'd encountered a tall, dark-skinned man wearing a broad-brimmed hat. He'd been well-dressed with broad shoulders and had told her, "Don't be afraid. I don't hurt girls like you." She knew something was off about him and began to hurry away, but as she ran, he stabbed her in the back. She screamed and managed to flee, while the man ran into the night. Following this murder, a local put up a reward of $25 for the capture of the murderer. On 15th June, the body of Addie Watts was discovered near the tracks of the Southern Railway, again with the same modus operandi. By this time, the press had dubbed the perpetrator as the Black Butcher, but the name that stuck was the Atlanta Ripper, due to the crimes being like those of Jack the Ripper in London's Whitechapel in 1888. On 27th June, the body of Lizzie Watkins was discovered. Following the deaths, many black women refused to go out at night, terrified they'd meet the same fate. Police issued a statement saying they were looking for a very tall black man and a smaller white man who had tried to disguise himself as a black man. They were believed to be complicit in the murders, but by 13th July, they both remained at large. The victims were similar. They were young women in their 20s or early 30s, black or mixed race, pretty and neatly dressed. The later victims had also been murdered in the same way by the perpetrator, using a sharp knife or sharp object, and after their deaths, he would mutilate their bodies, just like the Whitechapel murders. Most of the murders took place after dusk, and many on a Saturday night, but all were attacked initially from behind. The attacks generally took place in secluded or poorly lit areas or in open fields, which were shortcuts for the women as they made their way home from their work to their homes. On Saturday, 28th July, 22-year-old Mary Yeldell, a cook for the Seltzer family, heard a whistle while walking home. Well aware of the murders, she rushed back to her employers and told them what had just happened. Mr. Seltzer grabbed his gun and found the man, skulking in an alleyway. He told him to put his hands up, but he managed to get away. Sadie Hawley, or Sadie Hollis, was the next woman to become a victim on 19th July. A man called Henry Huff was soon arrested, as he'd been seen with Sadie by a witness. He was wearing bloodied clothes and had scratches on him, but claimed he'd been in a fight while playing pool. She had been found by Will Broglin, and her throat had been cut. She'd also had her head smashed in with a rock that was found bloodied in a field nearby. The police had 6 different suspects, including 27-year-old Huff, but none were ever convicted of all the crimes. Todd Henderson was identified by Emmylou Sharp as the man she'd seen, but at first she wasn't 100% sure. However, when he spoke, she screamed. That was enough for the police, especially as a clerk placed him near the scene of her mother's murder, and a conductor also placed him in that area. He was also seen in the company of Sadie Hawley shortly before she died. Henderson insisted he was innocent, stating he simply lived in the area, even claiming if he was going to murder someone, it would have been his wife. A final piece of damning evidence against him, at least for Sadie's murder, was that he claimed he didn't have a razor. Yet during police investigations, it was discovered he'd taken a razor to a barber's shop to get it sharpened the day after Sadie had been murdered. Henderson was arrested for Sadie's murder, but was never convicted. What threw a real spanner in the police's case against both Henderson and Huff was that the murders continued while the 2 men were in custody. In one case, a woman, Minnie Wise, had had her finger cut off following her death, and another woman was found decapitated, her heart removed, and she'd been disemboweled. Police arrested and charged Charles Owens for one of the murders, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment in April 1912. One final victim of the Atlanta Ripper is thought to have been Mary Rowland in 1914. One woman who was attacked and managed to speak to the police was Ellen Maddox, a cook who was on her way home from work when she was hit on the back of the head and badly beaten, so much so she was barely recognisable. She was interviewed by detectives while in hospital and told them that the man had run up behind her and began hitting her. She eventually succumbed to her injuries and died. It's thought there may have been up to 21 victims while he was active. Police were never sure, however, if the rest of the women were murdered by a single man, or if others were involved. The case of the Atlanta Ripper remains unsolved to this day.